Olivia Carter, the newly appointed Director of Flight Operations for the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, boarded Skyway Airlines Flight 204 from Los Angeles to New York City. Olivia, a trailblazer in the aviation world, had worked tirelessly to reach this prestigious position. As the first woman of color to take on such a role, she knew the significance of her work and the responsibility that came with it. Today, she was heading to deliver the keynote address at an international aviation safety conference, where she would outline the FAA's new initiatives to improve flight safety regulations. Despite the excitement of the upcoming event, Olivia was not feeling her best. A sudden migraine had begun to set in, threatening to derail her plans for the day. She hoped for a few moments of peace and quiet during the flight, a chance to rest and gather her thoughts before the busy day ahead. With a sigh, Olivia settled into her first-class seat, hoping that the migraine wouldn't worsen as the flight progressed. She closed her eyes, trying to relax, but her thoughts continued to race, knowing the significance of the conversations that awaited her at the conference. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. If this story made you reflect, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful content. As the plane cruised at altitude, Olivia tried to rest, but the migraine persisted, making it difficult to relax. She leaned back in her seat, hoping the discomfort would fade before the landing in New York. However, the peace she sought was soon interrupted by a flight attendant named Emily, who approached with a confused expression. "Excuse me, ma'am," Emily began, her voice polite but unsure, "I'm afraid there's been a mistake with your seating. This is a first-class seat, but I don't see your name on the list for this cabin." Olivia, taken aback by the question, immediately retrieved her boarding pass and showed it to Emily. "Actually, this is my assigned seat. I have a first-class boarding pass." Emily's face flushed as she glanced down at the boarding pass, clearly flustered by the misunderstanding. "I'm sorry, but I think you must have been mistakenly upgraded," Emily stammered. "You'll need to move to the economy section. There's been a mistake." Olivia's migraine throbbed harder now, frustration building. She had worked hard to earn her place in the aviation industry, and to be questioned like this, especially given her status, felt like an insult. She couldn't let it slide, she had to stand firm. "I assure you, this is my assigned seat. I'm the Director of Flight Operations at the FAA, and I'm headed to New York for a conference on aviation safety," Olivia stated, keeping her voice calm but firm. As Emily hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed, another passenger in the first-class cabin, Michael Lee, overheard the exchange. Michael, a business executive, quickly turned around in his seat and intervened. "Excuse me, but this is the Director of Flight Operations for the FAA. She's one of the highest-ranking officials in aviation," he said, addressing Emily with authority. "I think there's been some confusion, but she's entitled to that seat." Olivia looked at Michael, a sense of relief washing over her. His intervention had stopped the situation from escalating further. Emily blinked, her face turning pale as the realization hit her. "Oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am," she stammered, backing away slightly. "I didn't recognize you." Michael nodded at Olivia, a polite smile on his face. "It's not a problem. People in our industry should always be recognized for the important work they do," he said before turning back to his seat. Olivia gave a small, appreciative smile in return. Though her migraine still throbbed, she was grateful for the support. However, the incident had rattled her. She had faced challenges in her career before, but this moment reminded her of the biases that still lingered in the aviation industry. She wasn't just here to speak at a conference, she was here to make a difference, not just for herself but for the future of aviation as a whole. The awkwardness of the situation didn't end after Michael Lee's intervention. As Olivia settled back into her seat, her mind was still racing. The migraine pulsed behind her temples, intensifying her frustration. She had worked hard to be where she was, having fought her way through a male-dominated industry, and yet, here she was, being questioned and doubted based on nothing more than her appearance. The thought stung, and she had to remind herself to remain calm, especially given her important role at the upcoming aviation safety conference. Olivia closed her eyes, willing herself to relax, but the noise of the cabin seemed louder than usual. The voices around her, the movement of the attendants, and the shifting of the passengers all blurred together in the background. The physical discomfort was one thing, but the emotional weight of the encounter was harder to shake off. She had expected a smooth flight, a moment of rest before the high-stakes presentation. Instead, she was dealing with a scenario that reminded her just how much further the industry had to go when it came to recognizing the contributions of people like her. Minutes passed before the tension in the cabin seemed to ease, but Olivia could feel her frustration building as she tried to focus on what lay ahead. The seatbelt sign illuminated briefly as the plane descended into New York, and the captain's voice came over the PA system, announcing their descent. Olivia, however, was lost in thought. It was then that she heard footsteps approaching, and the voice of the flight attendant who had caused the earlier disruption caught her attention. It was Emily again, but this time her tone was softer, less assertive. Olivia sat up in her seat, preparing for whatever apology or excuse Emily had prepared. She wasn't in the mood to be placated, but she knew it was part of the job to handle these situations with grace. "Ms. Carter, I wanted to sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding earlier," Emily began, standing near the seat. The usual briskness of her movements had been replaced with a hesitance Olivia hadn't expected. "I had no idea who you were when I first approached you. I made a mistake, and I am deeply sorry for any inconvenience or discomfort I caused you." Olivia looked up at the young flight attendant, her mind still clouded with the weight of the situation. The apology was expected, yet it still felt empty. Olivia wasn't looking for an apology, she was looking for a systemic change, for a shift in how people in her position were perceived. But, at the same time, she couldn't deny that the gesture meant something. Emily was acknowledging her mistake, and that was something, at least. "Thank you for the apology," Olivia said, keeping her voice neutral but not unkind. She wasn't here to escalate the situation, but she wanted to make it clear that this wasn't simply about being mistaken for a regular passenger. But the reality is, this goes beyond a simple error. People in this industry need to be better educated about who belongs in these spaces, and why we deserve to be here. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a reminder of the biases that still exist in aviation. Emily stood there, looking slightly embarrassed but also thoughtful. She nodded slowly, absorbing Olivia's words. "I understand. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you for who you are. But I'll certainly make sure that I'm more aware in the future. I don't want to make anyone feel the way you were made to feel today." Olivia felt the weight of Emily's sincerity, but the truth was that one individual apology couldn't undo the years of systemic challenges that women, especially women of color, faced in aviation. Olivia's role as the director of flight operations at the FAA meant that she had the power to influence change, but even she knew that real progress took time. It wasn't about correcting one mistake, it was about creating a broader cultural shift within an industry that was resistant to change. "I appreciate your words," Olivia said, trying to soften the edge in her tone. "But it's about more than just me. It's about the next person, and the person after that. When we allow these kinds of assumptions to go unchallenged, we reinforce the very biases that prevent others from reaching their full potential. And that needs to change." Emily nodded again, looking more composed now. "I understand. And I'll do my part. I can't speak for everyone, but I will certainly do my best to educate myself and be more conscious in the future." As Emily walked away, Olivia returned to her thoughts. The migraine was still there, but now it felt like more of a background noise. She'd said what she needed to say, and while it wasn't a perfect resolution, it had opened a door for discussion. It wasn't enough to fix everything overnight, but maybe, just maybe, it would spark a change in the way people in the industry thought about equity and opportunity. As the plane began its final approach to New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, Olivia glanced out of the window, taking in the skyline below. The city was a symbol of progress, of possibility, but also of the work that remained. She was headed to the conference where she would lay out the FAA's new plans for improving aviation safety. It was a critical moment in her career, but she realized that this small incident had become a microcosm of the larger battles she faced every day. It wasn't just about changing regulations. It was about changing hearts and minds. The plane touched down smoothly, and as Olivia collected her belongings, she felt a renewed sense of resolve. The road ahead was long, but she knew that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. As she exited the plane and walked down the jetway, she prepared herself for the next stage of her journey, one where she would fight not only for safer skies but for a more inclusive and equitable aviation industry. The tension from the earlier incident with Emily had started to dissipate, but Olivia Carter couldn't shake the feeling that the day's events had opened a door to something much bigger than a single misunderstanding. As she made her way off the plane and into the terminal, her mind was still processing everything. She had handled the confrontation with grace, but in her heart, she knew the incident wasn't just about one flight attendant making a mistake, it was a reflection of an entire system that still had much work to do when it came to diversity, equity, and inclusion. After a brief stop at her hotel to drop off her bags and freshen up, Olivia made her way to the conference center. She had arrived in New York for one of the most significant moments of her career, the chance to deliver a keynote address at the National Aviation Safety Conference. The topic she was scheduled to speak on was one she was deeply passionate about: improving safety protocols and addressing gaps in the system. It was a topic she had fought for, and now she had the platform to advocate for real change in the industry. But as much as she was eager to make her voice heard, the lingering frustration over the flight incident kept pulling her thoughts away from the podium. The conference hall was buzzing with activity as attendees from all corners of the aviation industry filled the space. Olivia had arrived early, eager to gather her thoughts before taking the stage. She couldn't help but notice the sea of mostly male faces around her. She had long been accustomed to this. As one of the few women in her role, let alone one of the few women of color, Olivia had become used to navigating these spaces where she often felt like an outsider despite her accomplishments. She had learned to hold her own, to assert herself, but moments like the one on the plane reminded her how far the industry still had to go. As Olivia walked to the front of the room, preparing for her speech, a familiar face approached her, Captain Derek Reynolds. He had been the captain on her flight earlier, and after the incident with Emily, he had come to personally apologize for the mishandling of the situation. The airline had promised to investigate, but Captain Reynolds was one of the few who seemed genuinely concerned with the impact of what had happened. "Olivia, I wanted to find you and apologize again for the trouble on the flight," Captain Reynolds said, his tone sincere. "That shouldn't have happened, and I'm deeply sorry it did." Olivia smiled politely, though her mind was still preoccupied with the larger picture. She appreciated the apology, but she had already made it clear to Emily that it was about more than just her misunderstanding. "Thank you, Captain," Olivia replied, her voice calm but firm. "I know you weren't directly involved, but the reality is, these things aren't isolated incidents. This is about the culture we've built in aviation, where assumptions are made based on appearance, not merit. We have to do better." Captain Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. I think it's important that we have these conversations. I appreciate what you're doing, what you're standing for. It's not just about safety, it's about ensuring that everyone in this industry feels like they belong." Olivia looked at him for a moment, appreciating his words. There were far too many leaders in aviation who hadn't yet understood the importance of inclusivity in their work. Derek Reynolds, at least, was one of the few who seemed to be listening. "I agree," Olivia said. "But it's not enough for a few people to get it. The whole system needs to change." As they chatted briefly about the airline's initiatives to address diversity and inclusion, Olivia realized that this was the kind of leadership that would make a difference, not just someone who apologized and moved on, but someone willing to take a hard look at the culture and address its flaws head-on. Still, Olivia knew it wasn't going to be easy. She had spent her entire career pushing against barriers, and she knew that systemic change required more than just good intentions. It required accountability at every level. After the conversation with Captain Reynolds, Olivia's thoughts turned back to the conference and the keynote she was about to give. She had been planning her speech for weeks, but now, the words seemed more significant than ever. This wasn't just a chance to speak about aviation safety, it was a chance to address the very culture that had led to the incident she had faced on the plane. It was a chance to advocate for the changes that were needed, not just for the safety of passengers but for the fairness and inclusivity of the entire industry. Olivia stood at the podium, waiting for her introduction. As she looked out at the audience, she saw faces filled with anticipation, but she also saw the familiar divide, the lack of diversity in the room. It was a sobering reminder of how much work remained to be done. When her name was called, Olivia stepped forward and began her address. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady but strong. "It's an honor to be here today, standing before you all as the Director of Flight Operations at the FAA. But more than that, it's an honor to be able to discuss the future of aviation safety, an issue that affects every single one of us in this room. I am here today to talk about safety, but I'm also here to talk about something that is just as important, the culture of aviation itself." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "As we gather today to discuss safety protocols and regulations, we must recognize that safety isn't just about technology and systems. It's about the people who make this industry work. And until we address the biases, the discrimination, and the lack of diversity in our industry, we will never truly be safe. Safety isn't just about preventing accidents, it's about ensuring that every person, regardless of their race, gender, or background, feels valued and respected." Olivia could feel the room's energy shift as she spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She could sense the tension, the hesitation, but she was undeterred. This was the conversation that needed to happen, and it was time to have it. "I've been in this industry for a long time," she continued. "And I've seen the progress we've made, but I've also seen the barriers that still exist. The barriers that tell people they don't belong, that they're not good enough, simply because of who they are. It's time for that to change." She could see the impact of her words as the room began to absorb her message. Olivia knew the journey was far from over, but today, she was making a difference. She wasn't just talking about safety anymore, she was talking about a culture shift, one that would take time but was absolutely necessary. As she finished her speech, Olivia felt a sense of accomplishment. She had spoken her truth, and now, it was up to the industry to listen and act. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time, she felt hopeful that change was possible, not just for her, but for everyone in aviation. As Olivia Carter prepared to make her way to the conference, a sense of quiet determination washed over her. The speech she had just delivered was a pivotal moment in her career, but it was also a catalyst for something much larger. The conversation about inclusivity, respect, and systemic change in aviation had started, but Olivia knew that there was more work to be done, work that would go far beyond the walls of this conference room. After the speech, Olivia took a few moments to breathe, grateful for the overwhelming support she had received. The industry was beginning to wake up to the realities of discrimination and the lack of diversity within aviation, and though the road ahead seemed long, she was ready to push forward. As Olivia exited the conference hall, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a message from her team or a colleague offering feedback on the keynote. But the notification was different. It was from Stephen Thompson, her father's business partner. His message was short, yet to the point: "Meet me in the hotel lobby. There's something you need to know." Curious, Olivia texted back a quick acknowledgement and made her way down to the lobby. As she stepped off the elevator, she spotted Stephen sitting in the corner, his gaze fixed on the entrance. He looked up as she approached and offered a slight smile, though there was something in his demeanor that suggested urgency. "Olivia, I'm glad you made it down here," Stephen began, standing as she approached. "There's something you need to hear, something I think you should know about your family's connection to this airline." Olivia furrowed her brow, confused by the unexpected gravity of his tone. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. Stephen motioned for her to sit, his expression serious. As Olivia took a seat, Stephen pulled out a document from his briefcase. "I didn't want to overwhelm you during the conference, but I think it's important that you understand the full scope of what's happening." He slid the document across the table to her, and Olivia glanced at the first page. It was a financial statement from Pacific Skies Airlines, the same company whose flight she had been on earlier today. As she read through the numbers, her confusion only deepened. "What is this?" she asked, her tone cautious. Stephen leaned in, his voice lowering as he explained, "Your family, Olivia, through your father's investments and his partnership with Pacific Skies, owns a significant portion of this airline. In fact, your family holds more control over this company than you may realize." Olivia's eyes widened as the implications of his words sank in. She had known that her family's holdings spanned various industries, but this was something entirely different. "I had no idea," she admitted, her mind racing. "How much influence does my family have over the decisions made at Pacific Skies?" Stephen nodded, understanding her surprise. "It's more than just a financial stake. Your family's influence goes far deeper, especially in terms of ownership and operational oversight. And now, after today's incident, I think it's important that you understand how much power your family wields, both in terms of the airline and the industry as a whole." Olivia's mind was spinning as she processed this information. It explained a lot, from her role in the FAA to the small but significant interactions she'd had with people in the industry who had seemed to recognize her name, even before she introduced herself. It wasn't just her work that was opening doors, it was the weight of her family's legacy. "But why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Olivia asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "I've been working so hard to make my own way in this industry. I never wanted anyone to think I got to this position because of family connections. I've fought to earn respect, not ride on coattails." Stephen's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting hers with understanding. "I know, Olivia. And I admire you for that. You've done more than prove yourself. But the reality is, the stakes are higher than you think. This airline is under scrutiny right now, especially after the incident on the flight. Your position with the FAA, your involvement in safety protocols, it all ties back to Pacific Skies." Olivia was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of his words. The entire reason she had been speaking at this conference, to advocate for safety changes in aviation, was now intertwined with her family's holdings in the airline industry. It wasn't just a personal journey anymore, it was a legacy she hadn't fully understood until now. "I didn't want to burden you with this information until I felt you were ready," Stephen continued. "But I think it's time you fully understand the role your family plays here. You may not have known how deeply your father's investments are tied to Pacific Skies, but the influence is real, and it's powerful. This is an opportunity for you to not only shape policy but also influence change within the airline itself." Olivia sat back, stunned. She had always viewed her work in aviation as an individual effort, one that came from her passion and dedication. Now, she was faced with the reality that her influence was more complex than she had thought. She wasn't just advocating for change from the outside, she was positioned to make real change from within the industry itself. "How does this all fit together?" Olivia asked quietly. "What am I supposed to do with this information?" Stephen leaned forward, his tone earnest. "You have the power, Olivia, to change the way things work, not just at Pacific Skies, but across the entire industry. It's time for you to step into that role. You're already a leader at the FAA, but now you have the opportunity to shape the culture of the airline. We need people like you, people who understand both the regulations and the human element, running things." Olivia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what Stephen was saying. This wasn't just about advocating for safer skies, it was about transforming an entire industry from the inside out. It was about creating a legacy of respect, fairness, and inclusion, not just for women like her, but for every person who had ever been overlooked or undervalued in the aviation world. "I'm in," Olivia said, her voice steady and resolute. "I'll take on this responsibility. I'm ready to use everything I have to make a difference." Stephen smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "I knew you would be. You've always had the vision. Now, it's time to make it a reality." As Olivia left the meeting, her mind was already racing with the possibilities. She had a new role to play, not just as an advocate for aviation safety, but as someone who could change the very fabric of the industry. It was a daunting responsibility, but one she was ready to embrace. Olivia Carter walked briskly through the lobby of the hotel, the weight of the previous conversation with Stephen still heavy on her mind. What had started as a personal conversation about a minor incident on a flight had quickly spiraled into a much larger revelation about her family's influence in the airline industry. She had known about her family's wealth, of course, but the depth of their involvement in Pacific Skies Airlines had never been made clear to her, until now. She wasn't sure how she felt about it. Was she proud of the legacy she carried, or was it a burden that added pressure to everything she did? The revelation had come at a moment when Olivia was already questioning the industry's long-standing issues with diversity and inclusivity. Her position at the FAA had allowed her to fight for safety protocols, but now, her connection to the airline meant she had a chance to do something much more significant, reshape the very fabric of the airline industry itself. However, with that realization came responsibility. She wasn't just advocating for change in aviation, she was now part of the system that could make those changes happen. As she approached the conference room, Olivia could see Stephen standing by the entrance, talking to several other executives she didn't immediately recognize. She knew most of the senior leadership team at Pacific Skies, but these individuals were more familiar with the behind-the-scenes financial workings of the company. Stephen's presence gave her a sense of comfort, but it also reminded her of the power dynamics that she had to navigate carefully. "Olivia," Stephen said, noticing her approach. He stepped forward with a welcoming smile but also an air of professionalism that told her this was no casual meeting. "Thanks for joining us. I know this may feel like a lot, but we need to discuss what comes next. I've been speaking with the team, and we all agree that the current situation with the airline's diversity initiatives needs a complete overhaul. You're not just the FAA director anymore, you're an integral part of the airline's future." Olivia stood still for a moment, taking in the gravity of his words. It wasn't just about policies anymore, it was about using her role to make deep, systemic changes in the culture of Pacific Skies. She had always seen herself as an advocate for aviation safety, but now it seemed as though she had been thrust into a much larger position of influence, one that would shape not just regulations but the internal workings of an entire industry. "I'm ready for this," Olivia said, her voice steady. "But I need to know we're all on the same page. This is bigger than one flight, bigger than one incident. If we're really going to make change, it needs to start from the top." Stephen nodded, clearly pleased with her response. "Exactly. That's why we're here. We're committed to creating a culture that prioritizes diversity, inclusion, and respect across all levels. You'll have the full backing of the corporate team. This isn't just a "let's make it look good for a few months" situation. This is about long-term transformation." They entered the conference room together, where several key stakeholders from both the FAA and Pacific Skies were gathered around the table. Olivia's presence was immediately acknowledged with nods of recognition from the executives, many of whom were senior leaders in the airline. She knew they were all well aware of her family's significant stake in the company, but Olivia had made a point in the past to separate her family's business influence from her own work. Now, however, it seemed as though she was being asked to leverage that very connection. As the meeting began, Stephen outlined the challenges Pacific Skies was facing. Despite the airline's outward success, internal reports showed significant gaps in diversity, with very few women and people of color in leadership positions. Additionally, there was growing concern about how the airline handled incidents of discrimination, issues that had been glossed over for far too long. Olivia listened intently as the conversation unfolded, feeling both a sense of responsibility and urgency. This wasn't just about correcting a few isolated problems, it was about transforming the entire structure of the airline. "We need to invest in comprehensive diversity training," one of the executives spoke up. "And not just for flight attendants and ground crew, but for our senior leadership too. If we expect this to work, it needs to be top-down." "I agree," Olivia said, speaking up for the first time. "But we can't just stop at training. We need to hold people accountable for how they treat each other. We need to establish metrics for diversity, not just in hiring, but in employee retention, advancement, and how we address discrimination when it arises." There were murmurs of agreement around the table. Olivia's experience at the FAA had given her a keen understanding of regulatory frameworks, and now she could see how those principles could apply to transforming Pacific Skies from within. She wasn't just a passive participant in this conversation, she was the driving force behind it. Stephen chimed in, addressing the room. "We'll also be implementing a more robust reporting system, one that ensures every employee feels they have the tools to report any issues without fear of retaliation. This won't be a one-off effort. This needs to be ingrained into the very culture of Pacific Skies." Olivia couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at the direction this conversation was heading. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was surrounded by people who understood the importance of this mission. This was more than just a corporate initiative, it was about setting a new standard for the airline industry. Over the next few hours, the group discussed the specifics of the new diversity and inclusion initiatives. The plan would include leadership workshops, employee resource groups, and an emphasis on hiring from a broader pool of candidates, especially for senior positions. Olivia insisted that the airline partner with external consultants who specialized in diversity and organizational change to ensure the efforts were effective. This wasn't a process that could be rushed or done halfway. As the meeting drew to a close, Olivia felt the weight of what lay ahead. She had taken on a monumental task, one that would require not just corporate resources but a cultural shift within the airline. She wasn't just a regulator anymore, she was an agent of change, tasked with reshaping the future of an entire industry. But for the first time, she felt ready. The support of the airline's leadership, combined with her own personal and professional experience, gave her the confidence she needed to push this mission forward. Olivia stood and addressed the room one final time. "This is just the beginning. We've outlined the goals, but now we need to implement them. This is about more than compliance, it's about creating a space where every employee, no matter their background, can thrive. We owe it to them, and we owe it to the future of this industry." As she left the room, Olivia felt the full weight of what was ahead of her, but she also felt the deep sense of purpose that came with it. This was her moment, and she was ready to make it count. The tension surrounding the incident with Emily had not yet fully dissipated when Olivia Carter received an unexpected call from Stephen Thompson. She was seated in the quiet comfort of her hotel room, trying to relax before her upcoming meeting with the airline's leadership team. The call disrupted her brief moment of peace, and when she saw Stephen's name on the screen, she knew something was about to unfold. "Olivia," Stephen began, his voice tight with urgency, "there's been some movement on the legal front. I need you to be aware of what's coming." Olivia's stomach tightened. She had expected that the incident with Emily, though problematic, would be quietly resolved. The thought that the situation was escalating into something more serious never crossed her mind. "What do you mean, Stephen?" she asked, the unease in her voice impossible to hide. "Kate Summers' legal team has proposed a settlement, and they want it resolved quickly. They're offering a significant sum to avoid going to court," Stephen explained, his tone measured. "It's a standard tactic, of course, but they're trying to bury this. They don't want this to go public." Olivia felt a sharp pang of frustration. The apology from Captain Reynolds had been a step in the right direction, but now Kate was attempting to pay her way out of the situation. Olivia's blood pressure rose as she thought about how easily Kate was trying to avoid real accountability. "I won't let that happen," Olivia said firmly. "What's the next step?" Stephen sighed, knowing the gravity of what Olivia was saying. "I agree, but we need to tread carefully. I'm meeting with the legal team tomorrow to discuss our options. I wanted you to hear it from me first, before it hits the press." "I appreciate that, Stephen," Olivia said. "Let me know what I can do. I want to make sure this doesn't set a precedent. This isn't about money, it's about ensuring that people like Kate Summers are held accountable for their actions." After ending the call, Olivia sat back in her chair, her mind racing with the implications of Stephen's words. She had hoped that the situation would be contained, that it would be handled with professionalism. But now, Kate's attempt to settle had made it clear that the entire incident was about to become something much larger, something that might compromise her mission of changing the industry for the better. The power dynamics in aviation, and even in situations like this, were complex. She could feel the pressure mounting. Over the next few hours, Olivia reflected on the steps she had taken so far to make her voice heard. As the director of flight operations at the FAA, she had worked tirelessly to ensure that aviation safety was a priority, but now, it seemed that safety wasn't just about preventing accidents, it was about creating an environment where all individuals felt respected, regardless of their gender, race, or position in the airline hierarchy. She had always been a vocal advocate for those who were treated unfairly, but now she was in a situation where her actions, her decisions, could either reinforce the status quo or create a lasting change in the culture of aviation. The next morning, Stephen and Olivia met with the airline's legal team in a high-rise conference room overlooking the city. The atmosphere in the room was tense, as everyone gathered around the large table, their eyes focused on the matter at hand. Olivia could feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just about one passenger, or one flight attendant, this was about her ability to enforce systemic change within the airline and beyond. Olivia, one of the senior legal advisors, began, breaking the silence. "Kate's legal team is pushing for a quick out-of-court settlement. They want to make this all go away with a payment, and they're offering a substantial amount of money to settle the case privately." Stephen leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "What are our options?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "We can take the settlement, which would resolve the matter swiftly, but it would also mean no public acknowledgement of the harm caused by Kate's actions. Essentially, it would be as if this never happened." Olivia's heart sank at the thought. She had worked too hard for the integrity of the industry to let someone like Kate escape consequences so easily. "If we take the settlement, we're letting her off the hook," Olivia said, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "This isn't just about me, it's about setting the right precedent for how we handle this kind of behavior in the industry. If we let this go without addressing it, we're telling every employee, every passenger, that they can get away with this." The legal team exchanged uncomfortable glances, knowing that Olivia's words rang true. While the settlement would be the fastest, least messy route, it was clear that the long-term consequences of not addressing the issue properly could be far more damaging. Olivia had never been one to take the easy way out, and this situation was no different. "We're not going to take the settlement," Olivia stated firmly. "Kate needs to understand that actions like hers have real consequences. This isn't just about me. This is about making it clear to every employee, every person in this industry, that there are lines that can't be crossed." Stephen nodded in agreement, his gaze unwavering. "We need to take this to court. We'll fight for accountability and ensure that Pacific Skies sets the right example." Over the next few days, the situation began to unfold publicly. The press caught wind of the legal battle, and soon, the headlines were filled with stories about the FAA director who had been slapped by a passenger on a flight and was now seeking justice. The attention brought both support and criticism, but Olivia remained focused on the larger goal, changing the way the industry handled these types of incidents. As the case moved forward, it became clear that Kate's attempt to settle was nothing more than a strategy to protect her image and avoid the public scrutiny that would have followed a trial. In the end, after weeks of back-and-forth legal proceedings, Kate agreed to an out-of-court settlement, on Olivia's terms. Kate was forced to publicly apologize for her actions, and Pacific Skies Airlines agreed to implement new training for all employees to address issues of bias and discrimination. The airline also pledged to create a more transparent reporting system for passengers and staff alike. Olivia had won, at least for now. But the real victory wasn't the settlement or the apology. It was the fact that Pacific Skies had been forced to recognize the need for systemic change. This wasn't just about one passenger's behavior, it was about setting a new standard for how the industry would handle issues of respect, accountability, and fairness. As Olivia left the courthouse, she knew that the work wasn't over. The battle for a more inclusive and just aviation industry was just beginning. But she had taken a significant step forward, and for the first time, she truly believed that change was possible. The courtroom battle was over, and the legal outcomes had been settled. Ebony Reynolds had fought hard to ensure that the incident with Kate Summers did not go unpunished, and now, as she sat in her office at Pacific Skies Airlines, she couldn't help but reflect on what had transpired. The case had highlighted the systemic issues that plagued not just the airline but the aviation industry at large. But Ebony knew that the real work had just begun. The legal victory wasn't an endpoint, it was a stepping stone towards something much more profound. Ebony had always felt a deep connection to aviation, but her role had changed drastically in the past few months. As the FAA Director of Flight Standards, she had spent years working to improve regulations and make air travel safer for everyone. But this legal battle had opened her eyes to a new aspect of her work, the culture within the industry itself. As much as she had focused on safety protocols, there was still so much to address when it came to ensuring that every person, regardless of their gender, race, or background, had a place in aviation where they felt respected and valued. The victory in court had given Ebony a platform to push for systemic change, and now she was determined to use it. She had already proven herself as a leader in the FAA, but now it was time to take that leadership and apply it within Pacific Skies, the airline where her family's investments and influence were far-reaching. The connections she had to the airline industry, combined with her new role, gave her a unique opportunity to reshape how things worked from within. Her first priority was to ensure that the diversity and inclusion initiatives, which had been promised during the aftermath of the incident, were actually implemented. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge the problems, real, tangible actions needed to be taken. Ebony had learned that one of the most important factors in creating meaningful change was accountability. She needed to ensure that the initiatives were carried out with sincerity, and not as a token gesture. She began by working closely with the airline's leadership team to develop a comprehensive plan for improving crew training and internal policies. Ebony was adamant that the new training programs would not only address diversity but also tackle unconscious bias, microaggressions, and the importance of cultural sensitivity. It's not enough to simply tell people how to behave, she had said in one of her meetings with the training development team. We need to teach them why it matters. This isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Ebony's focus on empathy was crucial to her approach. She knew that fostering a more inclusive environment required more than just changing policies, it required changing mindsets. She pushed for interactive workshops and open discussions that would encourage staff members at all levels to confront their biases and reflect on how their behaviors affected others. It wasn't enough to merely complete a training session and move on, it had to be an ongoing process of self-reflection and growth. At the same time, Ebony worked on improving the airline's reporting systems. She was adamant that employees should never feel unsafe or unsupported when reporting incidents of discrimination or harassment. The existing systems, she realized, were insufficient. Employees were often hesitant to speak out because they feared retaliation, or worse, that their complaints would be ignored. Ebony knew that this was a toxic cycle that had to be broken. She advocated for the creation of a more transparent, accessible, and anonymous reporting system, ensuring that every employee felt empowered to report misconduct without fear of reprisal. As part of her broader strategy, Ebony also reached out to external organizations that specialized in diversity and inclusion consulting. She wanted to bring in experts who could offer fresh perspectives on how Pacific Skies could not only meet industry standards but exceed them. The goal wasn't just compliance, it was leadership. Ebony believed that Pacific Skies had the potential to become a model for inclusivity in aviation, a place where employees, no matter their background, could thrive. In addition to her work with the airline, Ebony remained committed to mentoring young professionals, especially those from underrepresented communities, who aspired to follow in her footsteps. She knew that she was in a unique position to help others navigate the barriers she herself had faced. Whether through formal mentorship programs or informal conversations, Ebony was determined to create a pipeline of diverse talent that would help transform the aviation industry from the inside out. Her work was not without its challenges. Some of the airline's more entrenched leaders were hesitant to embrace the sweeping changes Ebony was advocating for. There were moments when she felt as though she was pushing against an immovable wall. But Ebony had never been one to shy away from adversity. She had fought for every step she had taken in her career, and this was no different. She wasn't just advocating for herself, she was advocating for every person who had ever been made to feel less than or overlooked in this industry. Her vision for Pacific Skies, and for the aviation industry as a whole, was one where diversity wasn't just an afterthought, a checkbox to tick off during compliance reviews. It was a cornerstone of the company's identity, woven into every aspect of its operations, from hiring practices to customer service. Ebony knew that building such a culture would take time, but she was committed to the process. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but she believed in the potential for change. As she continued her work, Ebony also took time to reflect on the personal journey that had brought her to this point. She had never imagined that a single incident on a flight could set the stage for such a profound shift. The slap, the misunderstanding, it had all started as a personal affront, but it had become the catalyst for something much bigger. Ebony had the power to not only change the airline where she worked but to influence the future of an entire industry. The responsibility was heavy, but the opportunity was even greater. Looking out of her office window, Ebony felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just fighting for change, she was helping to build it, piece by piece. The legacy she was creating, one of inclusivity, empathy, and accountability, was just beginning. And with each step forward, Ebony knew that she was making a difference, not just for herself, but for the generations that would follow. As Ebony Reynolds continued her work at Pacific Skies Airlines, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The changes she had championed within the company were just the beginning. What had started as a personal fight for respect and equality had become a mission, one that would have lasting effects on the entire aviation industry. The systemic shift she had initiated was not just about creating a more inclusive workplace, it was about redefining what was possible for future generations of aviation professionals. Her role as a mentor had become just as important as her work within the company. Ebony had long believed in the power of representation, and now, she saw firsthand how the changes she had worked for were creating opportunities for others. She had opened doors for young professionals, especially those from underrepresented communities, to enter an industry that had previously been closed off to them. She was determined to create a future where talent, not background, determined success in aviation. Ebony's influence went beyond Pacific Skies. She had become an advocate for diversity and inclusion across the entire airline industry. Her work had caught the attention of industry leaders, and she was invited to speak at conferences and forums about the need for systemic change. As her platform grew, so did her commitment to pushing for lasting reform. She used every opportunity to advocate for policies that would address bias and ensure fair treatment for everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. Despite the progress she had made, Ebony knew there was still much work to be done. The road to true equality was long and filled with challenges. She continued to face resistance from some corners of the industry, but she was undeterred. Her sense of purpose was stronger than ever, and she remained committed to ensuring that future generations of aviation professionals would have a more inclusive and supportive environment to thrive in. As she balanced her leadership role at Pacific Skies with her advocacy efforts, Ebony's legacy continued to grow. The changes she had sparked within the company had become a model for others to follow. Pacific Skies, once just another airline, was now a leader in diversity and inclusion. Ebony had turned a personal battle into a movement for change, and she had shown that one person's determination could create a ripple effect that reached far beyond their immediate surroundings. Her work was not finished. Ebony knew that every step forward was just one part of the larger journey. But as she looked toward the future, she felt confident that the industry was on a path to greater equity, respect, and opportunity for all.